"Show me your ticket," the flight attendant snapped, her voice dripping with doubt as her hand smacked Owen's phone to the floor. Gasps rippled through first class, but no one moved to help the 17-year-old boy in the gray hoodie. To them, he was just another black kid who didn't belong. What they didn't know was that his silence hid a power strong enough to freeze an entire airline. And soon their complicity would be exposed for the world to see. The announcement for boarding echoed through the foggy windows of the international airport. While a line of well-dressed passengers in suits and pulling luxurious leather suitcases boarded the first-class cabin, Owen Carter, a 17-year-old black teenager, entered with confident but quiet steps, carrying a worn fabric backpack and a shiny black phone clutched in his hand. He wasn't wearing a luxury watch nor carrying a leather briefcase, and certainly didn't look like a businessman. He was dressed in a simple gray hoodie, faded jeans, and white sneakers with worn-out heels. He didn't look down, didn't seem embarrassed. He just walked straight to seat 2A, the window seat in first class, as though it belonged to him, because indeed it did. He opened the overhead compartment and gently placed his backpack inside. No one spoke, but eyes started to move. A silver-haired man in the row next to him glanced over and pretended to focus on his financial magazine. A young woman paused mid-lication of lipstick, her sharply defined eyes fixed on him for a few seconds. No one spoke, but every gaze seemed to silently say, "He doesn't belong here." Owen sat down, rested his hand lightly on the armrest, and pulled out a novel by Toni Morrison, placing his headphones around his neck like an invisible shield. Not playing games, not browsing the internet, just reading. He sat there calm and quiet, but no one saw him as truly ordinary. In this world, the silence of a black boy in first class was not considered natural. It became a question, a challenge, a presence that made people uncomfortable without knowing why. No one knew who Owen was, and no one asked. They just looked guest-judged in their minds. Never out loud, because sometimes discrimination doesn't need to be spoken. It only needs a look. Owen remained focused on his book as the sound of sharp, determined high heels echoed on the thick carpet each step, like a preordained rhythm of power. He didn't look up immediately, but the people around him did, because everyone knew Bridget Sanders had arrived. She was the head flight attendant for the flight, a woman in her 50s with platinum blonde hair, neatly tied up in a classic style, a flawless uniform without a wrinkle, and black shoes that gleamed like mirrors. To many, she was the ideal embodiment of discipline in the airline industry. But for those who had observed her more closely, it was clear Bridget didn't serve. She controlled. Her face broke into a half smile, the kind of smile practiced for thousands of hours in front of a mirror, but never reaching her eyes. That smile said, "Welcome," but her gaze emphasized, "I am judging." And when her eyes landed on Owen, they didn't stop out of surprise. They stopped because they confirmed an underlying suspicion she had carried the moment she entered the cabin. Bridget paused. The smile faded entirely, and in a voice so sweet it sounded fake, the kind of tone that could only come from power and prejudice, she spoke. "Are you sure you're sitting in the right seat?" Owen put his book down and looked up. His gaze wasn't challenging, nor did he lower his head. It was just calm. "Yes, this is seat 2A. Bridget pursed her lips. Her gaze flicked to the book, then to the hoodie and the worn sneakers. She didn't ask anything further, but extended her hand as if commanding, "Show me your ticket." Owen pulled the ticket from his hoodie pocket and offered it with 2 fingers. Bridget didn't thank him. She didn't nod. She just stared intently at the seat code, then at him, then back at the ticket as if searching for some fraudulent detail. Finding none, she continued, "Are you traveling alone? No adult accompanying you. I've flown alone many times before." Bridget raised an eyebrow slightly, not angry, not raising her voice. She knew exactly how to use softness as a tool to bend others. "Are you sure this is a real ticket?" At that moment, the entire cabin fell silent. A man in seat 2C suddenly pulled his seatbelt tight, his eyes still fixed on the scene. A woman in the row ahead paused mid-lation of eyeliner, pretending to fiddle with her phone, but her ears were perked. No one spoke. No one asked what's going on or what's wrong with the boy. Everyone just watched as though witnessing a play where the villain was performing exactly as written, because Bridget didn't need to raise her voice to show power. She only needed to sow a bit of doubt and let it spread through the air, like the pungent perfume she wore, which no one named, but everyone could feel discomforted by. Bridget looked at Owen as if he were something that needed to be pushed away, not served. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because he had done everything right in the wrong place. That was what made her uneasy. No one moved, but the tension in the first-class cabin was now as palpable as the scent of burning wires. No one had to shout, nor did there need to be a commotion. Just a woman in a flight attendant uniform and a black student refusing to back down. Owen remained seated, hands placed on his thighs, his gaze fixed on the window. Not flustered, not frustrated, but not backing down either. His calmness made Bridget more unsettled because she was accustomed to obedience, not self-control. And when Owen didn't react like the scolded children usually did, she began to lose control of herself. "If you don't leave right now, I'll call airport security." Her voice lost the cold politeness it usually carried. There was a tremor in it now, and for a moment, Bridget realized her authority was being challenged, not by shouting, but by silence. That silence frightened her. In a reflex, half angry, half trying to assert her power, Bridget grabbed the phone, sitting on the armrest of Owen's seat, her voice rising. "I need to check the booking information." Her hand struck Owen's hand hard enough to make a loud slap. Echo through the quiet first-class cabin. A woman in row 1F gasped sharply. An old man in seat 3A stopped flipping through his magazine. A frozen moment spread through the cabin, and then no one spoke. No one shouted, "Don't do that!" or "What's going on here?" Only Owen, the boy who had just been slapped in front of everyone, was the first to act. He didn't swat her hand away. He didn't snatch the phone back. He simply stood up slowly, not in a hurry, not trembling, just stood up as if leaving a classroom. He bent down, picked up his backpack, and pulled his hoodie string over his head. Every motion was slow, deliberate, as if it had been programmed in advance for a humiliation he knew he had to endure just because of the color of his skin. No one could rush to follow someone leaving in silence, because when that person says nothing, you are forced to hear your own breath and feel ashamed. Owen left the first ass cabin without looking back, without glancing at anyone. But he left behind something heavier than a physical slap, an unspoken accusation that made every heart witnessing it turn away or bow their head. In the last row near the restroom, Owen sat down. The seat was hard, the backrest unadjustable. The armrest wobbled, but he didn't care. He just pulled out his phone, opened the messages, and typed. "She just slapped my hand and sent me to the back of the plane. No exclamation marks, no emojis, no need for anger. Just one line like a silent indictment enough to shake a power system that seemed impenetrable." Owen rested his head against the stiff plastic panel behind him, next to the restroom at the back of the plane. The smell of disinfectant mingled with the occasional sound of the flushing toilet behind him, but he didn't flinch. No groaning, no complaints. The murmurs of passengers around him now faded to a distant hum at the edge of his thoughts. The only thing left intact in him was his dignity and the phone. He unlocked the screen and typed a simple line. "She slapped my hand and sent me to the back." No question mark, no capitalization, no sign of uncontrolled anger, just a truth raw and undeniable. More than $2,000 aisleway on the 50th floor of a towering glass building in New York, Jonathan Carter, CEO of Carter Air, stood before a series of strategy presentations on the company's expansion into the Middle East market. The shareholders nodded. The director of external affairs took notes. The room was silent, as though each breath was being controlled. Then his phone buzzed lightly. Jonathan only glanced at the screen, but that one glance was enough to make everything happening around him fade away. No one in the room heard anything, but they could clearly feel that something huge had just happened. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then he slowly placed the clicker on the table, turned to the strategic advisor next to him, his voice low, calm, but absolutely firm. "Keep flight 672 at the gate. There's an issue with seat 2A. No one asked why. One person just picked up the internal phone, and from there a chain of communication was triggered. Fast, precise, with no hesitation. At Portland International Airport, the emergency indicator light at the coordination center blinked. Captain Ree Hammond of Flight 672, finishing pre-flight checks, received a direct call from the CEO. In his 30 years of flying Boeing 757s across 3 continents, he had never heard an order like that. Hold position at the gate. Do not close the plane doors. Do not take off until further instructions from leadership. No further explanation, but with his experience, Captain Hammond understood. When a stop order comes from the highest level with no specific reason, the issue isn't technical, it's ethical. Meanwhile, in the first-class cabin, Bridget Sanders sat down in a folding chair in the front galley, holding a steaming cup of hot coffee. To her, what had just happened was just a minor incident that had been dealt with. The kid had been sent to the right place. The arrogance was contained in the smug half-smile now clearly on her face. "A kid like that sitting in first class?" she mumbled, taking a sip of coffee as if rewarding herself for her decisive handling. Beside her, the younger, less experienced flight attendant, Taylor Ree, with a keen, observant eye, hesitated and whispered, I think he had a real ticket, Bridget." "I saw it," said 2A. Bridget paused for half a second, raising an eyebrow as though hearing a joke. "Taylor, did you see what he was wearing?" "A hoodie, old shoes, no suitcase. You think someone like that paid $4,000 to sit next to a CEO? Taylor didn't respond, but her gaze started to change. No longer fearful, no longer avoiding, but the look of someone starting to realize something was very wrong. In the back seat, Owen still said nothing. He put in his headphones, not playing music, his eyes still fixed on the window. No one sat next to him, but the entire world seemed to be closing in on him, not with noise, but with silence. The harshest kind of silence, the silence of those who had witnessed but did nothing. And in that silence, a slap that seemed so small had become the alarm bell for an entire massive system. The atmosphere inside the cockpit of Flight 672 suddenly became as tense as a stretched guitar string when the special signal rang out on the internal control panel. Captain Ree Hammond, a veteran pilot with over 30 years of experience, immediately glanced at the screen displaying the message, "Hold at gate. Await direct instructions from Senior Operations Department." He frowned. Such directives were rare, and when they did appear, they usually related to serious security situations or political incidents. But this time there were no alarms, no escorting police, no clear reason. The plane was ready to leave the gate. The passengers were seated. The crew had completed the checks. Yet something was being kept secret, and it wasn't a technical issue. At the same time, a small window popped up on the main navigation screen. It wasn't flight data, nor satellite signals, but a secure internal communication channel reserved only for urgent calls from the airline's executive department. Captain Hammond took a deep breath and pressed the confirmation button. The screen displayed a familiar face, one rarely seen in situations like this. Richard Lane, the chief operating officer of Carter Air, appeared with a cold, unyielding expression, his neatly combed white hair, and a perfectly tightened burgundy tie. His eyes didn't look into the camera. They seemed to pierce straight through it. "Captain Hammond." "Yes, sir," Ray replied, sitting upright as though saluting in a hearing. "I need to speak to the head flight attendant immediately. Bring her to the cockpit. The door's open. No explanation. No pleasantries." And that's when Ray knew this was more serious than he had thought. At the front of the cabin, Bridget Sanders was busy checking the passenger list, or rather pretending to check it, avoiding eye contact with anyone after the minor incident with the out-of-place young man. She still thought everything was settled, that the kid had been kicked out of first class and everything was back in order. She had no idea that an earthquake had just been triggered by a single text message. "Bridget," a deep male voice called from behind. It was Captain Hammond. She looked up slightly, furrowing her brow when she saw him standing there as stern as if reviewing the safety list. "The cockpit calls for you now." "What's going on?" "I don't know, but they want to speak with you directly." Bridget hesitated for a second, just a second, but then adjusted her tie, smoothed down her uniform, and followed Rye into the cockpit. As the cockpit door opened, the light from the screens reflected on the tense faces of the two pilots. In the center of the control panel was a close-up image of Richard Lane on the secure screen. Bridget didn't have time to greet him before his voice rang out, cutting through the space like a cold blade. "Do you know who you just kicked out of first class?" Bridget froze. She blinked, her lips instinctively pressing together. I just saw a boy very young. Not, not someone who could afford a first-class ticket. Not someone who could afford it. Can you define not someone for me? Richard asked, his voice sharp as ice. Bridget stammered. I mean, he was wearing a hoodie, no expensive luggage, not fitting the first-class environment. Richard leaned closer to the screen. His name is Owen Carter. Bridget stopped breathing. The Carters. He is the only son of Jonathan Carter, the current CEO and co-owner of nearly 40% of this airline shares. Silence. The silence was no longer a gap. It was a black hole sucking all the air from the cockpit. Bridget felt the cold rush up from her wrist to her neck. Her fingers started trembling. In her mind, 100 images flashed. How she had questioned the boy, how she had lowered her voice and asked, "Is there an adult with you?" And worst of all, the slap when she snatched his phone. Richard continued, unrelenting. You didn't verify the ticket. You didn't check the passenger list. You didn't report the incident. And worst of all, you publicly humiliated a valid passenger in front of the entire cabin. A passenger who never said a word wrong. All because he didn't look like the person you wanted to see sitting in seat 2A. Bridget tried to take a deep breath, but the air in the room felt suffocating. I didn't know, she whispered softer than a whisper. We don't care whether you knew or not, Richard replied coldly. We only care about actions and consequences. Captain Hammond slowly stepped back, avoiding having Bridget face him directly at this moment. He knew all too well that this wasn't just a reprimand, this was a verdict. Flight 672 will not take off until the issue is fully resolved. And resolving it, Richard emphasized, means you will publicly apologize to passenger Owen Carter in front of the entire cabin and personally escort him back to C2A. What if I don't? Richard didn't answer immediately, but his gaze never blinked. Then you'll be removed from the plane and suspended immediately pending investigation. Once again, no one spoke. There was no need to speak because the cold wind from the cockpit had blown out and it was about to sweep through the entire cabin. Bridget Sanders stood motionless in the cockpit as if pulled taut between two opposing air currents. One, the pride honed over more than 20 years of flying, and the other, the harsh reality that had just descended like a mask being ripped off a false, powerful face. The coffee cup, still clutched in her hand, had long gone cold, much like the confidence that had been blown away from her eyes the moment she heard the name Owen Carter. Richard Lane's voice continued through the screen, still calm, still composed, but now each word felt like a sentencing command. Bridget Sanders, if you do not immediately publicly apologize to passenger Owen Carter in front of the entire cabin and escort him back to seat 2A, you will be immediately dismissed, removed from the plane, and suspended from all duties pending investigation. One sentence, 3 punishments, no way to back out, no escape. Bridget opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her hand tightened around the coffee cup, her fingertips turning white from the pressure, but her throat was dry, not from fear, but from the shame swelling up in her chest. Captain Ree Hammond stood a few steps away, silently observing. He had seen flight attendants reprimanded, criticized, suspended, but he had never witnessed such a swift and deep reversal. Just moments ago, this woman had been the symbol of authority in the cabin, commanding as if she were a queen. Now she was standing on the edge of collapse. Bridget took a deep breath. She had been used to yelling at subordinates, scolding unruly passengers, controlling the entire flight with her sharp voice and steely gaze. But today, for the first time, all eyes would be on her, not to listen for orders, but to see her humble herself. As Bridget stepped out of the cockpit, the first-class cabin suddenly became eerily silent. No more sounds of flipping magazines, no more clinking cups. Even the murmurs of passengers stopped abruptly, as if everyone felt something unusual was approaching. The first eyes to fall on her were from the middle-aged man in seat 3C, who had witnessed the earlier incident but turned away. Now he didn't look away. Next, the young woman in seat 4F, who had quietly lowered her camera when she saw Owen stand up. Now she had her phone in hand ready, but not to film Owen, but to record the return of what was right. Bridget shuffled her steps as though her shoes were weighed down with stones. She knew everyone was watching, and she knew each step toward the back of the cabin was a step away from the reputation she had built. In the last row, Owen Carter remained still. He didn't lower his head. He didn't slump his shoulders. His headphones still hung around his neck, his phone still in hand. But the screen was off. His eyes were fixed out the oval window, where the early morning light reflected the faint strips of clouds. He didn't need to look at anyone, nor did he need to listen. He already knew what the silence of the crowd felt like, and now he was waiting to see what they would do with it. The sound of Bridget's heels grew closer. Flight attendant Taylor Ree stood silently by the rear cabin door, watching Bridget without blinking. No hatred, no sympathy, just the look of a witness to an inevitable truth. Bridget stopped in front of Owen. For the first time, she didn't look him in the eye. Her gaze dropped as if hiding from herself. She extended the two-way ticket. The ticket she had once doubted, once rejected, once turned into an accusation without evidence. Her voice cracked. Owen, I want to apologize for everything that happened. I was wrong. A pause. I'll escort you back to your seat. Owen didn't respond immediately. He let the apology hang in the air, spreading like a stone thrown into a still lake. Not because he was waiting for someone to defend him, but because he wanted everyone to hear, and they heard the heavy breath of the man beside him, the slight rustling from the rows ahead, a phone camera turning on from somewhere, but no one intervened. No one broke the silence because they knew this moment wasn't theirs. This was the moment Owen had been chosen to have the right. He turned his head looking directly at Bridget. No anger, no reprimand, just one question cutting into her heart like a knife. You call that inconvenient a public slap, and being kicked out of your seat is inconvenient. Bridget opened her mouth as if to retort, but then stopped. The words got stuck in her throat. You're not mistaken, Owen continued, his voice, still light, but piercing deeper than any shout. You looked at me and decided that I didn't belong there. The young woman in 30 to older Fahrenheit began to cry. The man in 28C shifted in his seat. An older woman placed her hand over her mouth. Everyone knew this was no longer a conversation between two people. This was an indictment. Bridget lowered her head. I was wrong. I had no reason. No one stood up to clap. No one cheered. But as Owen slowly stood, adjusted his jacket, put his backpack on his shoulder, and began to walk back to the front, the entire cabin went silent, as if holding its breath. Not because someone commanded it, but because they understood. This was the moment someone who had been pushed out was walking back, not to reclaim a seat, but to assert that they had the right from the beginning. Each step Owen took down the aisle seemed to carry an invisible current, shame, awakening, and hope. And Bridget, who once thought she controlled the passengers, was now walking behind Owen in the role of someone who needed to be forgiven. That moment, the second Owen stood up slowly, pulling his worn backpack onto his shoulder. The entire cabin seemed to freeze in a thick layer of dense air. No one spoke. No one moved. They just watched. But this time they didn't look at him as if he were the outsider. They looked as if they were waiting for him to walk past to feel something about themselves. Bridget Sanders walked behind Owen, still holding the two-way ticket like an offering. Each step she took now echoed like a hammer strike against the ego that had once confidently believed, I am always right. No more commanding glances, no more sharp orders, only a woman being forced to face the consequences of the biases she never thought she carried. The young flight attendant, Taylor, stood aside in the aisle, her eyes meeting Owen's as he passed by. She didn't say a word, but the slight nod of her head said it all. I saw, and this time I won't look away. Owen walked slowly down the aisle, not because he hesitated, but because he allowed each gaze to touch him, each silence to witness him, and every bit of avoidance to be forced to confront itself. As he neared the first ass cabin, the man sitting in seat 3C, who had once lowered his paper to avoid being associated with the incident, could no longer pretend. He lowered the magazine, gripping the edge of his seat, as if he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. In 4F, the young woman still held her phone, but she had lowered it long ago. In her eyes was a mix of shame and admiration, a rare emotion, but sincere. As she reached the first row, Bridget quickened her step, moving to stand next to Owen, then gently, almost as if no longer herself, lowered her head like a student standing before the one she had wronged. "Owen, I apologize. There was a misunderstanding. Please return to seat 2A." A small apology so difficult to utter, but still it was spoken in front of the entire cabin, the people who had stayed silent when she humiliated him. Owen turned his head to look at her. His eyes weren't angry, not cold, but the stillness in his gaze was like a mirror, and it made every excuse no longer stand a chance. He answered slowly, clearly enough that every passenger heard, even those who had pretended not to hear the slap earlier. "You're not mistaken." Bridget froze. "You just decided I didn't belong there." That line wasn't just a response. It was the exposure of a prejudice masked as reasonable doubt, something society had subconsciously accepted. No one spoke. No one clapped. But in the long silence, every heart skipped a beat. Bridget didn't say anything more. She just nodded slightly like someone accepting their sentence, then stepped aside to let Owen pass. Seat 2A was still there by the window, the early light streaming through the thin glass. Owen's old book was still in the same spot. Someone had neatly straightened it. Maybe it was Taylor. Maybe someone else. But that action, as small as a silent apology, made the air around C2A feel different. It was no longer the place he had been thrown out of, but the place he returned to with honor. Owen sat down, buckled his seatbelt, and said nothing more. He didn't need to speak. His return didn't need to be marked with applause, but with a silence that changed its tone. No longer the silence of complicity, but the silence of acknowledgement. And for the first time, the first-class cabin was silent out of respect. In the back cabin, Taylor pulled out her phone, opened the internal notes, and typed a line. "He's back in seat 2A, but it's us who need to change our seats within ourselves." Bridget stood beside, not moving anywhere. She had to stand there to witness what she had once thought was disruption, yet turned out to be the rightful order she had never recognized. Her hands clenched tightly. The ticket in her hand crumpled, but she didn't let it go because it was the evidence of a mistake and an opportunity if she had the courage to admit it. Next to her, the man in the Navy suit who had sat beside Owen earlier that morning without saying anything when he was kicked out, leaned slightly, then spoke softly. "I saw it all, but I didn't speak up because I thought it wasn't my business." Owen didn't turn around, but he flipped the page of his book and responded, his voice both light and heavier than any executive's verdict. "That's exactly why no one did anything." The man straightened. No rebuttal, no self-justification. He understood. He hadn't been insulted. He had just been enlightened. Owen's words echoed like a thin thread, taut and piercing through the first-ass cabin, and suddenly they pulled every face back to their own conscience. The man in seat 3C, who had been the first to lower his head and pretend to read a magazine when Owen was humiliated, now sat up straighter, his hand resting loosely on his lap, clenched involuntarily as if in reflex. No one called his name. No one condemned him. Yet he felt as though he had just been publicly judged by a quiet sentence. Not far behind, a middle-aged woman in seat 30F, who had quietly raised her phone to record when Owen was slapped, also quietly looked down at her screen. The video still sat in her phone's library, not uploaded, not shared, not done anything with. Her hand trembled slightly, not out of fear, but because suddenly she realized she was not as innocent as she had thought. She had chosen to record as an observer, but she didn't intervene, didn't stand up. She had seen the wrong happen, but instead of speaking, she held the camera like a shield to protect herself from having to choose. At the front of the cabin, Bridget Sanders stood next to seat 2A. No longer a figure of commanding authority, but a living witness to the mistakes she had made. For the first time in 20 years of flying, Bridget didn't know where to place her hands. She clasped them in front of her stomach, then let them drop. Her right index finger occasionally turned her wedding ring on her left hand, a habit she hadn't realized she was doing. She didn't know if she was trying to find the familiar feeling again, or if she was avoiding the reality. But what Bridget couldn't avoid anymore was the gaze of everyone. It was no longer the gaze waiting for her orders, but the gaze waiting for her to fully acknowledge her fault. And then something that had never happened on any Royal Crest flight occurred. A voice spoke soft but steady. "He's right." Everyone turned. The speaker was a woman in her 60s, sitting in 3D with silver hair pulled into a high bun and a cream-colored hand-knitted cardigan. She put down her book and stood up, even though her body didn't seem as agile as before. "I've been sitting here since this all started. I saw everything, and I didn't do anything." A few quiet gasps, not because I agreed, but because I was afraid of doing the wrong thing. But now I realize silence doesn't make me more right. It just made me part of the wrong. Bridget turned to look at the woman. Her eyes seemed to contain something that had just cracked open. Not resistance, but the shedding of the shell of I was just following the rules. Next, a man's voice rose from behind. "I'm a lawyer." His voice was even firm. A man in a gray suit wearing glasses, sitting in 5A. "I know well that discrimination doesn't need anyone shouting in your face for it to exist." He adjusted his glasses and continued. "I saw a passenger treated differently just because of how he was dressed and the color of his skin, and I thought he must have done something wrong. But it turns out I was allowing myself to normalize something wrong." The atmosphere in the cabin was no longer one of suffocating avoidance, but of tension as masks began to fall one by one. Owen didn't say anything, but he quietly looked at each person, not to judge, but to witness. He understood. This was no longer a story about a seat. It was a story about shadows learning to step into the light. In the back cabin, Taylor Reed, the young flight attendant who had hesitated to defend Owen, stood by the water cabinet, silently watching through the cabin screen. She saw each person speak, each head, bowing, each apology given without defense, and a sense of guilt rose in her, because in reality the first one to speak up should have been her. Taylor breathed slowly, pulling a small notebook from her uniform pocket. She typed a brief line. "Silence is no longer neutral. From today, I need to learn how to stand up from that boy." In the main cabin, something unexpected happened. Bridget voluntarily lowered her head. No one asked her. No one forced her. She stepped forward a pace, her voice low, no longer carrying the usual arrogance. "I used to think I was fair, that I worked by the rules, that I didn't let emotions interfere." She paused for a beat, "But this morning I didn't need any rules. I just needed a look. And I judged Owen simply because he didn't look like the kind of person who should be sitting in 2A. A moment of silence. Heavy. "I have no excuses. I can only say I was wrong. And if I can, I want to make it right. Not just for Owen, but for all the people like him who've been pushed aside just because they didn't look like." At the front cabin, Captain Ree Hammond quietly received the information. The airline still hadn't authorized takeoff. The flight was still being held, but he wasn't upset because he knew a flight may be delayed for hours. But a lesson like this, if missed, could delay a lifetime. Owen still didn't say anything more. But when his gaze met each person who had spoken, it was like a silent nod, a wordless acknowledgement that they were no longer spectators. They were becoming true witnesses. The moment Owen silently watched as those around him began to speak their apologies, the entire first-class cabin was enveloped in a strange silence. No longer complicity, but awakening. But outside the steel door of Royal Crest Flight 672, a storm was beginning to form. Not in the sky, but on social media. From the back cabin, the woman in seat 30F, who had recorded the clip of Owen being slapped, kicked out of seat 2A, was no longer just a bystander. She opened the app, selected the clearest part, the slap, the stunned silence, then Owen's calm face as he stood up, a wordless indictment. No filter, no added text. She wrote a short caption. He did nothing wrong but was pushed out just because he didn't look like someone who could sit in 2A. At the end, Gasha, first-class silence just 3 minutes after posting. The views passed. 15,000, then 100,000, then 1 million. And then it exploded at the 42nd floor conference room at Royal Crest headquarters. The PR office was tense. The young media assistant shouted, "We're going viral on every platform. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. It's all blowing up." The head of the communications department stared at the screen. There, the 32-second clip replayed. Bridget's voice asking, "Are you sure this is your seat?" Followed by the slap, the deep inhalation of passengers and Owen walking away. He pointed to the screen. "That's not just a video. That's living proof of something people have felt for years, but no one has recorded so clearly." Number 1, first class. Silence quickly surpassed all national trending topics. Tweets appeared in rapid succession. That kid just wanted to sit and read and he was kicked out. What year are we in? Why didn't anyone in first class stand up? That slap didn't hurt physically. It was a bloated dignity. Every time you think it's not my problem, remember Owen? At a small cafe in Brooklyn, a law student played the video. She watched it, then reposted with the caption, "If a white student in a suit were slapped and kicked out of first class, would anyone stay silent?" And back in the cabin, passengers gradually realized that their silence no longer belonged to that enclosed space. It had been exposed to the entire world, and they began to feel ashamed. A middle-aged man, his face flushed, opened his phone and saw his own face in the video sitting near Owen. Head bowed, hand on his chin, doing nothing. He muttered, "Damn," then turned off the screen, but it was too late. He could no longer hide in the shadows. At CEO Jonathan Carter's office, the assistant rushed in, panting. "The clip has gone global, sir. News outlets from CNN, BBC to Al Jazeera want to interview Owen. They're calling it the silent rebellion." Jonathan wasn't surprised. He simply stared at the text from his son that had been sent earlier. "I don't want people to just see the slap. I want them to see the silence that came with it." He nodded slightly. His son didn't need saving. The boy was waking up an entire system. Bridget Sanders, now sitting in the crew rest area, lowered her head to look at her phone. On YouTube's homepage, the video was titled, "Black Student Slapped and Kicked Out of First Class. Turns out he's the CEO's son." The comments below flooded in like waves. "She needs to be fired. Anyone who stayed silent is equally at fault. That boy is why we need to teach kids how to stand up even when they say nothing." Bridget had no more defenses, not because the camera had recorded the incident, but because she had known the truth the moment she acted, yet still chose prejudice over procedure. In the cabin, Owen remained seated in two-way. He didn't know how far the clip had spread, but he heard the faint vibration of his phone in his pocket. He didn't read it, didn't check. He understood. When he stepped off this plane, he would no longer be a silent 17-year-old student. At a high school class in Atlanta, a sociology teacher paused the lesson. She opened the video rewound to the moment Owen turned back to look at Bridget and said, "You're not mistaken. You just decided I didn't belong there." The whole class fell silent. A black student in the front row wiped away tears. A white student behind him whispered, "Why do I feel guilty about this?" The teacher turned off the video. She looked at her students. Then slowly she asked, "If you were sitting in that plane cabin that day, what would you have done?" And that was when the story left the realm of a flight, a student a slap. It became a question for society at large when you witness injustice. Will you stand up or stay silent? Soon after the hashtag #1, first-class silence surpassed 4 million mentions. The headquarters of Royal Crest Airlines, the 67-story tower in the heart of the city, was no longer the place for discussions about stocks or market strategy. The atmosphere inside felt like a hospital struggling with an outbreak, but instead of a biological virus, they were facing a moral pandemic, the public's loss of trust. On the 51st floor, the main conference room unusually opened in the afternoon. The blinds were lifted and light flooded in, but it wasn't enough to illuminate the sweating face of the communications director, Ellen Royce. She opened the first slide, a downward trending chart. Since this morning, brand trust has dropped by 17%. Every minute, there are around 600 negative mentions on social media. Even our Japanese and German shareholders have sent emails asking for an explanation. Her voice was her eyes darting between the red numbers on the screen. But the next voice made the entire room freeze in silence. Alan, a board member, Mr. Martin Hale, with silver hair and a calm gaze, set his coffee cup down. "We don't need a PR campaign. We need a 17-year-old boy to remind us about character." All eyes turned to him. Ellen opened her mouth, ready to retort, but then fell silent. Mr. Hale continued, "Let me remind you. In the viral video, Owen Carter didn't yell, didn't demand compensation, didn't threaten to sue. The boy just stood up and quietly walked to the back of the plane. It's how he stayed silent that made society stand up and take notice." Another person, Mrs. Monica Ellis, head of ethics and human resources, added, We've spent millions on diversity training, unconscious bias seminars, but now it's all exposed as useless if not practiced at the right moment. Suddenly, Richard Lane, the chief flight operations officer, stood up. He didn't display a slide, didn't look at his iPad, just spoke in a steady, firm voice. I spoke with Bridget. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just kept repeating that she thought following the process was enough. But as Owen said, silence is not neutral. Silence is a choice. And sadly, we as an organization have chosen silence for far too long. The atmosphere was so tense that even the sound of the air conditioning was sharp. The overhead lights cast a yellow glow on the faces of those in power, now stunned for the first time by a young black boy, forcing them to look at themselves. The PR director spoke hesitantly. So, what should we do? A press conference? An apology video? Martin Hale shook his head. No, a video is just words. We need action. And the first action is not to avoid the one who brought this change. He looked around the conference table. Let's invite Owen Carter here. Not to make him a representative image, not to put a logo on his shirt, but to invite him to help rebuild this very system. Some younger directors look confused, but Owen is just a student. He doesn't have expertise. Monica answered for them exactly why he needs to be here. Because people like us with expertise have missed the most important lesson. Character doesn't need a degree. Downstairs in the VIP lounge, Jonathan Carter, the CEO and Owen's father, quietly watched from his phone. He didn't interfere with the meeting, nor did he demand any privileges for his son. But when he received the news that the board wanted to invite Owen to participate in the behavior reform program, he sent a short message. Ask him if he wants to help make a change. Don't command and don't ask for sympathy. My son is not a victim. He is the one holding up the mirror to the whole system. At the same time, in a small room at Carter & Sons headquarters, Owen sat still by the window wearing a wrinkled white shirt, his iced tea beside him, long gone cold. He looked at his phone. 9 unread emails, 6 calls from CNN, 3 from ABC, and an invitation to speak at the National Diversity Conference. He sighed, not from exhaustion, but because the world suddenly expected more from him than just a seat with the right ticket. On the phone screen, a message appeared. Oh, and the airline wants to invite you to participate in an anti-discrimination training program. You don't have to accept, but if you want to change something, this is your opportunity. Owen didn't respond immediately. He looked out the window, seeing his reflection faintly in the glass. If I don't accept, then that slap will just be an incident. But if I do accept, I can turn that slap into the start of change. Owen sat up straight, his hand gripping the phone that still displayed the last message from his father. He read it once more. You don't have to agree if you don't want to, but if you want to change something, this is your chance. There was no music, no buzz of notifications, only silence like the first-class cabin, that day where everyone heard yet no one dared speak up. He typed slowly, then stopped. Thought deleted it and wrote again. I don't want to be a symbol, but if I say nothing, that slap will just be an incident. Jonathan Carter, the CEO who had struck deals worth billions, stared at the message without replying immediately. He knew his 17-year-old son had just made a decision that could not only change his airline, but could alter society's view of the invisible discrimination people face every day. The next morning, on the 38th floor of Royal Crest, the meeting room was cleared and specially prepared. No more complicated plans, no more profit charts. Instead, each table had a small white notebook with silver lettering, Bias-Free Cabin Internal Reform Initiative. Over 120 people were in the room, from the head flight attendants, flight supervisors, regional managers to recruitment heads, and behavioral training leaders. They were not told who the speaker would be. They only knew there was an important meeting. When Owen Carter walked in, the room fell silent. He wasn't wearing a suit, no tie, no media team trailing behind him. He was still in his black hoodie jeans and eyes that held depth. Not the look of someone seeking fame, but someone who carried the experience of having his dignity stripped without having to shout to be heard. Owen placed his bag down and stepped up to the podium. He didn't hold any papers, didn't look at a teleprompter. He just stared at the people in front of him, the very ones who thought they were just following procedures. He spoke. I know many of you think I'm here because I'm the CEO's son, but if I weren't, If I were just an ordinary student, if no one had filmed that day, would any of you have realized that you were wrong?" The room remained quiet. Owen continued. "The slap didn't hurt, but the way the entire cabin turned away, like I didn't exist, like no one wanted to get involved. That's what really hurt me." A middle-aged woman in the second row, the head flight attendant, Valerie, raised her hand. Her voice trembled. "I've done something similar, not with malice. I judged by how they looked, how they spoke, and I guessed whether they were a VIP or not. No one ever told me I was wrong until today." Owen nodded slightly. "That's why I agreed to participate in this program. Not to teach you anything, but to share how it feels when someone is judged, not by their actions, but by their appearance." Richard Lane, the flight operations director, sat at the back of the room, listening intently. He remembered the way Owen had looked through the internal camera on the plane. Not bitter, not cursing, just a look that made the entire organization feel that they had been wrong in the one place they thought was the safest. After the short speech, there was no applause, just heads bowed, pens beginning to write in notebooks. Don't let a passenger's appearance make you forget to check your heart. If you slow down for 10 seconds and ask kindly, maybe you won't be wrong. Your actions can hurt others even if you don't mean to. At the end of the meeting, HR Director Monica Ellis approached Owen. She didn't extend her hand as usual. She bowed her head. "You don't need to be a hero, but you've made us the ones who thought we were mature. Relearn from scratch." Owen replied, "I don't want you to apologize. I just want that next time. When you see a kid like me sitting in the front seat, no one will ask, 'Are you sure this is your seat?'" Meanwhile, in a small barbershop in Chicago, the TV broadcasted the morning news. Royal Crest Airlines announces a new behavioral training program with the participation of Owen Carter, the student who was removed from first class despite having a valid ticket. The airline calls this a turning point in the industry's operational ethics. The shop owner, a black man in his 60s, turned up the volume, looked at the customers, and chuckled. Another boy teaching the whole system how to be human. And then across many places in America, from classrooms to boardrooms, from airports to family kitchen tables, a question echoed not just for Royal Crest, not just for the airline industry, but for everyone. When someone is treated unjustly right in front of you, will you look the other way or will you stand up? When Owen Carter returned to the first-class cabin, no one asked him, "Are you in the wrong seat?" No probing gazes, no quiet whispers. Seat 2A was still there by the window at the front of the cabin where a week ago it had become the center of attention nationwide. But it was no longer just a seat. It was no longer just a reward for wealthy customers. It was no longer a number on a boarding pass. It had become a symbol, a reminder, a lesson, an awakening. Owen sat down. His hand rested on the armrest, his gaze passing through the small circular window where the early morning sky was beginning to shift into a soft orange hue. His breath was slow, even not from tension, but because he knew. In this moment, the entire cabin was learning how to be silent in the truest sense. The sound of footsteps echoed from behind. Taylor, the young flight attendant, who had witnessed the event but had not acted slowly, walked toward him. Her hand lightly rested on the cabin wall, her shoulders slightly tilted, a gesture not of a flight attendant, but of a person learning the value of sincerity. "Again, thank you for not letting us continue pretending we didn't see." Owen didn't speak. He simply nodded slightly. But that nod wasn't just a polite gesture. It was an acceptance, a silent forgiveness. In seat 3B, a middle-aged businessman lowered his gaze. He had been silent when Owen was kicked out of the seat. Now he dared not look directly. His hand clenched the newspaper with the prominent headline, "The Slap That Shook the Airline Industry. 17-year-old student forces airline to confront bias." In seat 4D, a young white woman suddenly took out her phone, opened the saved clip again, but this time she didn't share it. She just wanted to watch it again. The moment Owen was humiliated while no one spoke up to remember how she had remained silent. And in the last seat of the cabin near the toilet where Owen had once been forced to sit, it was now empty, an empty space for invisible wounds. No one sat there. Not because it was dirty or noisy, but because it was the seat of collective shame. Today, the head flight attendant was not Bridget Sanders. After the internal meeting and the spreading clips, she had been indefinitely suspended, awaiting a hearing from the disciplinary board. But what she left behind didn't vanish with her uniform. It lingered through the way passengers looked at each other longer, the way flight attendants spoke more slowly, and every please now tinged with a bit more humanity. From the control tower, the flight signal was transmitted. The plane began to roll. Owen felt the familiar pressure of gravity lightly pressing his back against the seat. But this time, he didn't hunch down. He didn't shrink as usual because this time he was not a passenger in the wrong seat. He was the one forcing the entire system to adjust its value label. When the plane reached cruising altitude, the attendant served food. A young white male passenger approached carrying a tray of water and spoke softly. "I don't know what to say, but I want to thank you for making me look at myself." Owen looked up, not smiling, not nodding. He simply said, "Remember this feeling next time when you see someone being treated unfairly and no one intervenes?" The man nodded, then retreated to his seat. He didn't just carry a tray of water. He carried a warning about the next silence. In the overhead compartment, a small black handbag was marked with the name O. Carter. Inside the bag was an unsent draft, a response to the official invitation from the Royal Crest Board offering him the role of honorary passenger ethics advisor. He hadn't sent the letter yet, but today, sitting in 2A, he knew the answer wasn't in saying yes or no. It was in the way he walked onto this plane without lowering his head. It was in the way he stayed silent but made everyone listen. In the flight attendant's room, Taylor took out a notebook. Inside, she had written a note in trembling ink. "Silence is not harmless. I used to think if I didn't do anything wrong, I was fine. But today I understand if I don't speak up, I am part of the wrongdoing." As the plane prepared for landing, the seatbelt sign lit up, but no one rushed to fasten their seatbelts. A quiet feeling enveloped the cabin. Not because everyone was tired, but because everyone understood they had just witnessed something bigger than a flight. The atmosphere in the training room at Royal Crest Airlines Internal Center seemed to freeze when Owen Carter stepped onto the podium. No spotlight, no introductory music, just the absolute focus of more than 100 people, veteran flight attendants, security supervisors, lounge staff, and regional managers. They had seen the video. They had read the news headlines. They had heard the belated apologies, but this time they weren't there to hear from the media. They were there to hear from the person who had truly been moved and had moved an entire industry. Owen didn't hold papers, didn't need a microphone. His voice was low but clear, resonating through the space like each word was a knock on a door that had been locked for too long. "I'm not here to make anyone feel guilty. I just want you to understand the feeling of being doubted just because of who you are." The air in the room felt still. A woman with silver hair, wearing a flight attendant uniform with a 25-year service badge, sat in the front row, gripping her pen tightly. Owen continued, "I didn't do anything wrong that day. I didn't cause a disturbance. Didn't threaten anyone. Didn't break any rules. I just sat in my seat. But the looks, the words, the frown, and finally the slap, all of that came from something unspoken but universally thought. This black boy can't be a first-class passenger." The last line rang out like a loud noise among the seats. No one argued. No one made excuses. A male flight attendant, about 50 years old, thin with the name tag, Steve K., suddenly raised his hand. His voice was choked, but every word was clear. I did something similar. Not to the extent of kicking a passenger out, but I've looked at black passengers and wondered if they belonged. I stayed silent. I thought I wasn't biased, but I was just avoiding it. Today, I'm not staying silent." He bowed his head, tears welling in his eyes. Others began to nod quietly. Owen didn't nod to thank him. He didn't smile. He just took a step back and continued to share, not with theory, but with experiences that no manual could replicate. "No one shouted at me that day, but the collective silence of the entire cabin made me feel like I didn't exist. The worst kind of discrimination doesn't come from people who hate you. It comes from those who think silence is neutral." A female security supervisor dressed in a black vest. A serious expression on her face flipped her notebook open and then closed it. She looked straight at Owen. I used to think if I didn't directly do anything wrong, I wasn't a bad person. But now I know doing nothing when you see injustice is also a choice. And I chose wrong. A voice rose from the back. The voice of Monica Ellis, the HR director. But this time it wasn't an order. It was a confession. We used to think behavior training was enough, that just having policies would make us safe. But Owen pointed out sometimes the way you look at someone impacts them more than the way you serve them. The entire room fell silent. Owen looked at everyone for the first time, letting emotion shine through. His voice softened. I used to think I just needed to lower my head, read a book, and ignore the injustices. But then I realized if I say nothing, I'm teaching others that their silence is right. Today, I'm not here to make anyone apologize. I'm here for us to commit. No one should be doubted just because of their appearance. No one deserves to endure prejudice in silence. A slight movement began in the audience. One young flight attendant stood, then another. No one signaled, but they all stood up, not to applaud, but to show they had truly listened. No applause echoed, only eyes looking directly at Owen as if saying, "We didn't see, now we do." In the hallway outside the conference room, a new notice was posted on the wall. It wasn't a meeting schedule or a promotional flyer. It was just a line in white text on a black background. Sometimes the one who makes you change doesn't need a title, just the truth. Royal Crest Bias-Free Cabin Training Program. When the training session ended, Owen left the room. Some people shook his hand, some simply nodded, but no one pretended not to know who he was. Not the CEO's son, not the boy kicked out of first class, but the person who forced an entire industry to sit down and relearn from the beginning. After the first training session with Owen Carter, while everyone was still silent from the echoes of an unavoidable truth, a brown envelope appeared on the desk of the director of the reform program. It simply read from Bridget Sanders. Inside was a handwritten letter, the handwriting firm, but with smudged ink, a sign of a trembling hand as it wrote, "I know I don't have the right to ask for forgiveness. I'm not expecting to be forgiven. But if this training program is truly about real change, I hope to be the first student not to make up for my mistakes for others to see, but to relearn from the rubble I created myself. Bridget." The letter was sent to Owen along with a short video recorded by Bridget on her personal phone. No special effects, no professional lighting, just a middle-aged woman with her hair tied back, sitting in front of a plain gray wall, looking straight into the camera, unguarded, unmasked. I'm the one who kicked Owen Carter out of seat 2A. I used to think I was polite, fair, neutral. But after watching the video from that day, I realized I was the embodiment of a system built on biases I never realized I carried. I didn't understand what respect was. She paused, swallowed. The next words didn't come out with strength. They were pushed out by vulnerability. I thought if I didn't yell, if I didn't insult, I was innocent. But it turns out sometimes contempt is quieter than any insult. The video was less than a minute long, but it was shared millions of times within 3 hours. At the PR department of Royal Crest Airlines, a young brand consultant looked at the screen softly, whispering, "She's not acting. She's really broken." No one objected. No one laughed mockingly because they all knew that late realization was so raw, it made one's heart ache. At the same time, in a new flight attendant training class, the lead instructor, a veteran attendant named Valerie, played Bridget's video for the whole class as a training material. When the video ended, she asked, "Did anyone notice something special?" A young trainee raised their hand. She didn't say I was wrong. She said, "I didn't understand that. It's heavier than an apology." Valerie nodded because it's not about one wrong action. It's about living a whole life wrong and thinking it was right. As for Owen, he didn't react immediately to the letter or the video. He just sat in his small office watching the video 3 times. Each time he watched, he paused at the moment Bridget's eyes were on the screen where there was no longer confidence. No authority, only a woman learning how to look at herself. The next day, Owen called Human Resources Director Margaret Ellington. "I want to meet her, not to make peace, but to see if that awakening is deep enough to start over." Margaret was silent for a few seconds. Then she agreed. The meeting was arranged discreetly in a private room at the training center. No cameras, no media, no microphones, just Owen and Bridget. Bridget arrived first. She wore a simple white shirt, no suit, no name tag. When Owen entered, her gaze left the desk, meeting his directly. I know I'm the one who started everything, and I don't expect anyone to believe I've changed after just one lesson, but I'm here not because I was forced. Owen didn't interrupt. He just listened. Bridget continued. That day when I saw you, I didn't think I was being discriminatory. I just thought something's wrong here. But now I know that feeling was the monster bred in silence. Owen looked at her directly. I don't need you to keep blaming yourself. I need you to pass that on to those who were like you. Bridget looked up, her lips pressed tightly. Then she nodded, a heavy nod but clear. That day an internal recording was held. Bridget volunteered to be the mentor for the self-reflection on personal bias class, standing alongside a young black instructor. On the whiteboard she wrote the opening line with her own hand. I am a living example that a polite smile cannot cover up the nature of discrimination. And in the corner of the room, Owen stood there. No microphone, no applause. He just gave a faint smile, then turned away. Because what mattered wasn't who bowed their head before him. It was those who had once been shameless, now beginning to blush. Under the soft golden light of the social studies classroom in a high school in Atlanta, a video was projected onto the large screen. It wasn't an old documentary, nor was it a Zoom lecture. It was a short speech by Owen Carter recorded after the press conference when he landed from that fateful flight. The teacher, a middle-aged white woman with salt and pepper hair who had been a volunteer in human rights campaigns, didn't introduce it with a long speech. She simply said, I want you to listen to this, then we'll discuss. Owen's voice echoed deep and calm, yet weighted with every breath. If you've ever looked the other way, when you've seen someone being humiliated, then you're part of that silence. The class went completely quiet. No whispers, no jokes, only eyes beginning to turn inward. In the back row, an 11-year-old black boy wearing a simple white t-shirt turned to whisper to his mother, who was waiting outside the classroom behind a glass observation window. Mom, can I be like him? The mother, her hair neatly curled, her face worn but kind, walked into the classroom through the back door, gently sat next to her son. She didn't answer immediately. She placed her hand on his shoulder, her gaze fixed on the screen where Owen was looking directly at the crowd of reporters. Then she spoke not just to her son, but to an entire generation. If you're willing to stand still when you're knocked down and turn silence into strength, you won't just be able to be like him. You could change the world. At the Royal Crest headquarters, it was 9:04 a.m., and a meeting was called, not by the board of directors, but by the younger employees, those who had witnessed the whole story on the screen and felt the need to do more than just amend policies. During the meeting, Taylor, the flight attendant who had silently watched Owen be kicked out, was the first to speak. I thought I wasn't involved, that I didn't slap him. I didn't give the orders, but I saw it and I did nothing. She looked up this time, not lowering her head to avoid eye contact. If we don't change from the roots, from the way we look at a passenger, judging a person just by their appearance, then Bridget's bowing her head by silence. It's just acting. It's not atonement. A regional director spoke up. So what do we do? Another training session, more policies. Owen, who had been invited as a special guest, responded not angrily, not raising his voice. No need for anyone to sign anything. Just next time when you see someone being pushed out of their seat, someone should stand up, even if it's just one person. The room fell silent, but not because of embarrassment, but because everyone was asking themselves, will I be that person next time? The following day, the bias-free cabin program was officially launched. No loud fanfare, no imposed mandates. Instead, it was a personal pledge each employee signed as they entered the training center. I don't just serve passengers, I listen to their silence, and I won't let any seat become the boundary between fairness and prejudice. At the bottom of the pledge, there was a small note inspired by the lesson from Seat 2A, Owen Carter. A few weeks later, Owen emerged from a private meeting with the CEO and advisors. As he walked through the airport lounge, he saw a young black boy checking in at the first-class desk. The boy wore a small suit, glasses, and tightly gripped a ticket with the clearly marked Seat 2A. The desk clerk looked down, then looked up. No questions, no doubts, just a smile. Thank you for arriving on time. Have a wonderful flight." The boy nodded and ran into the security area, unaware that someone standing far off was watching him, smiling without anyone knowing. Owen Carter no longer needed to sit in seat 2A because now every seat carried a story, a lesson, and a reminder. Don't wait until there's a slap to realize that silence has lasted too long. No one on that flight that day knew that a valid ticket, a slap, and a silence would shake an entire system. But the truth is, we don't need to shout to change the world. Sometimes we just need to sit firmly in the place we deserve and let our silence become the wake-up call for collective conscience. Nah. What do you think would happen if you were the one sitting in seat 2A that day? Would you speak up or would you choose silence? Share your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear from you. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share it with others who need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss future stories where ordinary moments lead to extraordinary change.